And I forgot one little housekeeping thing. Well, you'll
Yeah,
probably
go
go
ahead.
for
Go
another
ahead.
hour again, hey Jim, roughly. And
Yeah.
then we can take a 5 minute break, but if you guys are happy to keep going, then we might just keep going and do a bit of Q&A with Jim, and then we'll call it quits pretty much. That's probably enough info for today. So about an hour and a half, hour three quarters, I'd say, all in all. But Jim he delivers concentrated information, so add 5 liters of water to make it taste nice. So your head will be spinning most likely. Back to you.
Sounds good. Um, in that regard, I actually want to start with a few reflective questions for you. Um, and they're so three questions, and they're versions of the same question, but just coming at the same thing from a few different angles. But to start with, I'll just ask you to note down your thoughts. So if you've got pen and paper in front of you, or if you want to open up a document on your computer as you're working, and just jot down a few thoughts. I'll give you about a minute for each question, uh, and then we'll have a conversation once we finish the three. So the first question, which is a broad one, and you're welcome to take this any direction that you want, is, in your opinion, what makes a good counsellor? What are the things that you think makes a good counsellor? You have a 10 seconds or so on that question. So my second version of this question, I might bring up similar things, might bring up different things. But if you had a loved one that needed to see a counsellor or a therapist, and they wanted your opinion or recommendation about what they should look for in a counsellor, what sort of things would you look for in a counsellor that you'd be willing to refer or recommend a loved one to go and see?
I'll say something.
Oh, sorry, that's all right. We're just noting down ideas at
Oh,
the moment. Yeah. And then we'll come back once we've done the three. Yep. A few more seconds on that one. And the last question is, thinking about if you were in the position where you were hiring a counsellor, you were employing a counsellor, and you're doing interviews and you're listening to referees talk about this person, what would be some green flags? What would be some things that you would hear that would make you confident in this person as a counsellor that you would be hiring? Give you a few more seconds just to jot down anything else that's coming to mind. All right, well, let's come back together. Love to hear some thoughts. Now, I won't go question by question. You can just sort of take your answers as a pool of things. What were some of the things you noted down? What are some of the qualities that you look for in a counsellor? Anyone willing to share an example or two?
I started off with, oh, yeah, who's that?
Jesse, I think.
Jesse, yeah, go for it, Jesse.
I'll just go with what I said for question 3 about if you're hiring. I think I would want someone who's obviously relatable, but also humble and have a capacity to, within that humility, to know their own limits, whether that's personally or professionally. And I also wrote down having a bit of direction or a dream or a goal, not just kind of ambling away through things.
Yeah, lovely. A few great qualities there, Jesse.
Sandra raising her hand.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I really appreciated the questions. I think it was really interesting, and mine built, so it was like as per previous plus.
Yes.
And it's interesting because I work in a organization, and one of the big things that has come up in the past is aptitude with technology and note-taking skills and that sort of stuff. Being able to stay on top of that part of the role is quite important in an organization. I mean, for private practice too, but definitely from an organization. And ethics came up in the last one for me, which hadn't come up till then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so ethics. But yeah, then there's aptitude with technology, but there's also there's an element to the role. It's about sort of attention to detail, you know, being able to keep up with tasks, those sorts of things, which I think is an important part. And actually something doesn't always come up, so I'm glad that it did. Yeah. Other thoughts, other things that people had on the list?
I'll come in.
Thanks.
For me, it's about presence. Having just being present.
Yeah.
Okay.
So being able to be present. Yeah.
Just know, you know, just 100% listening.
Yes.
Processing, you know, without thinking about dinner, you know, and bring yourself back to presence. And then also, I guess, and through that is body language, showing that you're present and attentive, and emotional presence too. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that the ability to communicate an undivided attention and to be giving that. Yeah. In the midst of all of it. Yeah. Lovely. Thanks, Leanne.
I think for me, and I mentioned that last time as well, Jim, it's that ability to self-reflect, you know, well, take yourself very seriously, but not too seriously, and keep looking at, okay, where can I empathize better, or just because that's what we teach at uni as well. There's difference between reflective practice afterwards, but also reflexive in the moment, where I'm willing to look at myself like, am I still on the right track here? Is this still going where I think I want it to go, or where the client wants it to go? So to kindly sort of mentor yourself from above in a way, is like, look at this, like, are we still doing well? Yeah, I think that's always been an important one for me, because otherwise, I tend to get caught in my own little train of thought, and my train of wherever I think I'm going, and the client looks at me a bit weird and go like, okay, that was a faux step there, a bit of a faux pas. Yeah, that's right. So that self-awareness, insight, reflection, all of those sorts of things that are crucial. And I think there's an element what Jesse said of a humility, an ability to be able to learn and work on yourself. Yeah. Who else?
If I'm to synthesize mine, so I'd be open-minded, genuine, as well as a bit direct sometimes. Flexible or quite adaptable to different situations, and organized. as well.
Nice. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
That one's come up again. That's great. Yeah. Thanks,
I wrote down a few different things. I think life experience is vitally important.
Yeah.
I think the value of what we share within ourselves through life experience is very important, but there's a humanness to it. So there has to be this level of humanness, and I talk a lot about this in my private practice. It has to be real.
Yeah.
And there has to be a rawness to it, I believe, because humans are wired for connection. So the availability of not being perfect and actually creating an imperfect space for people to feel that they have the capability to be vulnerable enough to be able to open up, and then therefore feel supported by somebody that is actually a human being as well.
Yeah. Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you.
Silvio made a comment in the chat, Jim, saying how good they are at assessing the person's situation, etc., in any given moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, those really delicate, nuanced judgments that we're making, and not judgments in a sense of, passing judgment, but just, making little assessments, working out where we're going next, all of those things. Yep.
I've got authentic and also being the right fit. And if we're not recognizing that.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. And I think I add on top of that, there's also the and being able to be adaptable too, right? So be able to work in with the person that's in front of you or the situation that's in front of you. Yeah. It's a wonderful list we're putting together. I've probably got time for one or two more people if you had something you wanted to share that you haven't had a chance to yet.
Nobody's mentioned empathy yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Sometimes it goes without, not goes without saying, but sometimes it's almost so obvious we forget to say it. Yeah. Absolutely. Thanks, Madonna. One more.
I think I resonated with what Jessie said at the beginning around, particularly if you're thinking about a growth mindset. So the person that they're actually sitting in front of has the availability to be focused, like they can actually see that that person is capable of change themselves. So I think being the right fit and having the right person is obviously vitally important, but actually almost that practicing what we're preaching is really important as well, especially depending on what focus is in your practice. But being able to have that growth mindset yourself to then be able to show that there is a capability of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's, thank you everyone. I mean, it's a really thoughtful and insightful and balanced list of things that people have been considering here. And I want to show you a little bit in terms of what the literature has around this, and you'll actually see some really similar themes come out. One of the things that I'd point out, though, which is really interesting to me anyway, and part of the reason I started going on this journey is I think there's one element where if I sit down and I think about the types of things that make a good counsellor, the types of things that I look for in a counsellor when I'm a client or when I'm asking a loved one to, go see someone, the kinds of things I'm looking for as an educator, as a supervisor, sometimes if I was, if I'm ever hiring someone, it's a similar kind of thing to what you've generated. And yet in the research conversation, like if we actually sort of take the whole body of literature that informs counselling and psychotherapy, we've got this great imbalance, and it's probably something you're already aware of, between the amount of energy that we've put into studying modalities, so in other words, into studying therapy, versus the amount of energy that we've put into studying other elements of the process, which we now know actually are bigger variables, such as the client, the person of the client and what they bring, the nature of the alliance and the relationship and how that influences things, and the counsellor or the therapist, right? And so just as an example, there was a count done about 10 years ago, so this is a bit out of date, but you know, at that point there was about 12,500 randomized controlled trials on therapies, on modalities. And there was only about, or a couple of years ago, about 60 to 100 studies on empirical studies on the therapist, right? So we actually just, the sheer imbalance is quite strong. And yet we know the therapist or the counsellor, the person of the counsellor has an impact. So anyway, from what we've been able to find out within that, and I will show a few slides at this point, just so that you have a visual. These are all in the notes that I put in the chat. So some of the things, you know, that we've been able to find, and it will mirror a lot of what people were saying as well in that introductory conversation, is that there's a few major things or a few major categories of qualities that are important in practicing counsellors. Two of which shouldn't be a surprise, and that's something like knowledge and skills, right? And in just about any professional practice, it's understandable that there will be discipline-specific knowledge and discipline-specific skills that are going to be involved in the practice of that profession. One of the things that stands out, it's not like exactly unique. There are other professions that have similar things like this, but it is distinctive. Not every profession has this to the same degree. Are these sorts of more personal qualities, which is a lot of what we talked about. So the quotes that are up there are a couple of different studies that were summarizing a whole bunch of literature around it. And there's words that we heard from ourselves as well. Genuineness, sincerity, open-mindedness, flexibility. I think we heard versions of acceptance, empathy, tolerating ambiguity, sociableness. I think someone said being relatable. You know, all of these sorts of awareness of limitations we've talked about. You know, there's a number of different things that I think have come up, and some others, which I'm sure would also be resonant with a lot of people. So some of what the literature says. And so another couple of summaries. The image on the left was a word cloud that I put together out of a range of results from a number of different studies. And that was talking to professionals. It was reviews of literature. It was interviewing educators, the public, clients. And again, we'll see this same type of word or this same type of quality, warmth, awareness, respectful, flexible, congruent. The image on the right, there's been a number of studies done over the years on what have been called master therapists, so people that are recognized as being highly experienced or highly effective in this field. And again, the characteristics that keep coming out, and there's been, you know, dozens of studies all over the world that have done this, have an element that are around, that's around competence, that's around knowledge, but it's also about, you know, these words like wisdom, curious. Someone mentioned life experience, you know, this understanding of the human condition. You've got things again around generosity, a will to grow, self-aware, humble. So you've got all these words that keep coming up. The one for me that's the kicker, though, is the fact that we can have these conversations in amongst ourselves. So we have these conversations amongst us as professionals, and we can talk to, you know, educators, supervisors, researchers. When we come and ask clients, though, when we actually ask clients about their preferences, what they look for in a counsellor, once again, we get a really similar trend. And I think that's important to hear the client voice in the midst of all of this. And that middle point sums it up. It's often when all of these themes are brought together in terms of what are clients looking for. And even, you know, some studies have looked in those early moments, those early minutes of therapy. What are they judging, or what are they picking up from the counsellor? is these two things which are around competence. So again, is this person a professional? Do they have their profession-specific knowledge and competence? But also warmth, right? There's these personal factors, care, empathy, attentiveness. Someone talked about that attentiveness, that ability to be present, sincerity, compassion, calm, stable, self-contained, conscientiousness, prepared, helpful. People have talked a bit about, you know, that organization, that attention to detail, all of those sorts of things. So once again, you know, what the research shows and what we're seeing in practice, and I think it's one of my mentors would always talk about, you know, don't be afraid of research. Good research backs up good practice, right? And so I think this is really a case for all of us. But for me, what it leaves is a really interesting little developmental task that we do as counsellors. And it's a challenge to us in our practice, not just when we're starting out, although I think it's very acute at that period, but throughout our careers, and maybe we could also say throughout our lives. It's a lifelong journey. And the challenge is around this really interesting blend that we do within our profession and within our practice, which is the blend of the profession and the personal, right? It's this way in which we bring together who we are as people, who you are as an individual, along with that professional knowledge and skills, to create sort of a unique voice. You know, one of the things you form as a counsellor is you do counsellor in this really unique way. That's that blend of the professional and the personal. But as the quote on the left says, some of those qualities that we're talking about are also ones that are often less tangible or least measurable. And, you know, the quote on the right, again, puts it this way, you know, that this blend of professional and personal selves kind of develops a therapeutic self. And so that's quite different to a lot of other professional identities that are formed. So I'll just turn the slides off for a sec. And for me, again, the journey I've been on, I'll get to sort of sharing a bit about where I'm at and a little bit of what I found out. But I suppose for me, it was always the case if I didn't want to just settle with these things are fuzzy, these things are intangible, you know, we just kind of let them be. I wanted to think more closely about, well, what does it take for practitioners in this field to undergo this this personal development? How is it that we develop, change, grow, cultivate as people as well as professionals? We'll get to that in a minute. Love to hear any responses that you've got at this stage, any reflections that are coming up for people, or questions for me, or even just ways that you connect it back to your context, right? What sort of qualities does the work demand in you, in what you're doing?
I've got a comment on that.
Yeah.
I think it becomes like a transition from where the skills you've learned and understood and the learning you've done becomes second nature. Yeah. So you're not thinking about what it's just, so your presence and your intuition, your capacity for all those things actually is, so your personality, I guess, is in the forefront. And the skills that you're not even thinking about what skill I'm going to use. They just happen. Yes. You know, so I think for me, there's a phase where you start to realize, oh, I didn't even need to think about that, you know. But that, I guess, is a level of confidence. Yeah. You know. Yeah. So I think that for me is important. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I think you're spot on. And so it's interesting though, because I think it's an integrative process. It's the way in which these things sink deep into us. So it's and most people will reflect, you know, when you first start out learning your counselling skills, it can feel somewhat mechanical, right? And it can feel like you are play acting at something. But what those skills are actually getting you to do is almost act your way into a new way of being, right? So in other words, just this little process of habit formation. So why do we get, and then again, I'm putting my educator hat on, why do we get our first year students to ask fewer questions and do more reflections, right? Well, what we're actually doing is trying to teach a certain mindset through action. So we act our way there, which is to listen more closely to what the client is saying and meaning rather than what we think that they're saying and meaning. Yeah. Does that make sense? And so, but just by the doing of it, that stuff then starts to sink in more habitually. So it's a great point, Leanne.
That journey towards unconscious competence in a way, if you look at those 4 stages of learning, where I see many students always struggling with this conscious competence, like they know some stuff, but then they're also very consciously incompetent because they don't know really how to do it well. And that big struggle until some point where you just, like Leanne said, where you just do it and you don't even, you're not really even aware of the fact that you well, at least, with some reflective practice on it. I think that's a good stage to be. And ideally we get there.
Yeah. It's also something that I would say is a phrase I use is something about being a counsellor that makes you a little bit weirder, doesn't it? Right? Like there is those little changes that sometimes you pick up. I'll give a little example. When one of my kids was really little, we were with some friends down at a park here in Brisbane that's next to the Brisbane River, and a boat went past, and my little 2-3-year-old son was sort of, very excited and is pointing, he's going, boat, it's a boat, fantastic, it's a boat. Anyway, then the boat sort of travels further downstream and it starts going around the corner out of sight. And again, this 2-year-old sort of, the lips starting to droop and is going, oh, boat, and this thing's going away. Anyway, I sort of instinctively kind of scooped him up and gave him a cuddle. I think I said something like, oh, mate, it's really hard when something you love goes away. And my friends will turn to me and just go, oh, for fuck's sake, Jim, you don't have to be a counsellor all the time. Or something along those lines, maybe less direct than that with children about. But, it was just one of these things where it's like, sometimes this stuff sinks in and, what becomes every day for us is quite unusual. And we talked a bit about presence and attention. Again, one of the things I put to my students is, when was the last time that someone listened to you for an hour with undivided attention, right? And we don't even think about doing that, do we? Right? We aim to do that with every client. And we forget that might be an incredibly rare experience. I mean, you're lucky to get 5 minutes in everyday life of someone's undivided attention, but to actually have that for an hour, remarkable. Before we do anything else, that's already a gift we've given.
I just would like to say, I think that example that you just gave with about your son, I think that's a very good example of how you actually want to be with your clients, because from the moment you try to look at it from their point of view, that's why you connect. I think if you let your own cognition go and just connect and be in the moment and meet them where they are, and that's, I think, what we were talking about before. That's what I sometimes find difficult, to knowing that you need to present yourself in a certain way that people know what you're talking about, but at the same time you want to connect and be very genuine and yourself, but then my own inner critic, I guess, is in the way then in that, so to speak, to once I'm able to let that go, that inner critic, then I can connect and be myself. And that's when the clients pick that up as well, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, that was it, basically.
Yeah. I think you've articulated it really well, though, isn't it? Because it's kind of from the outside looking in, counselling looks a certain way. And yet, as I say, when you do it, this is actually what you're trying to bring, isn't it? It's kind of like, yes, I'm bringing a knowledge set, I'm bringing a skills base, but I'm also trying to get myself in, again, the phrase I use, into this sort of way of being. I think presence is another lovely word, to bring a presence, to bring a personal presence into this interaction. And that requires something different, doesn't it? It's not just a skill set, it's asking something of us as people in the work that we're doing. Yeah. Sandra.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have a question which might be shelved till the end, but I wanted to put it out there. And I had a brief conversation with Mark about this last year, but for background where it's coming from, I work in a neighbourhood centre, and a lot of my work is with parents who are already involved with child safety. So they've had children removed or are they under supervised orders. And we also have a men's behaviour change program running as well. So collusion is a word that comes up very, very often. And yes, so I'm thinking about something that I think about a lot is, how do you connect, as Nancy, so clearly said, without also colluding with the client?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure if I'll right at this moment give an
no,
answer to that.
Exactly.
But I'd love to maybe circle back to that question after I've said a bit more about where we're at, because it's the right question, isn't it? Right. And again, it's not a purely technical question. It's going to actually require us to be thinking about, well, what parts of ourselves are we bringing to this interaction? How are we balancing that? How are we even exercising some form of practical wisdom in making those assessments, those tiny little nuanced decisions in the moment, seesawing back and forward between a couple of different extremes? So it's that kind of thing, isn't it, that you're bringing? Yeah. A great example about, in a context, what this is actually requiring of us. Yeah. Any other comments or reflections at this point? Yeah, Rosemary?
So I just want to say, I think techniques and the knowledge are things that you can learn quite quickly. But I think there's this space that, as a counsellor, you're sustaining that ethical practice, that safety and practice, I guess, over time. But it's really developing this aspect so that it's actually going to move that person from using those skills that we're talking about, those counselling skills, to actually being a counsellor. And it's that space that I've kind of just took from this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
And I think time's an important variable in it, isn't it? Right. This is not
maturity.
Sorry, go on, Matt.
Yeah, and the maturity, that you gain, and the wisdom.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think maturity is probably a better word in this context than competence, isn't it? And not to say, so along with competence, we're also aiming for maturity, and it's these things working together. Yeah. And on that side of, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, but the idea of, well, how does this development take place? Well, it doesn't seem to be the kind of thing where you go, well, I went to a one-day workshop and I came out as wiser, or I came out as more compassionate. It doesn't seem to be that it's like, well, I read an article and that, made me more humble. It's more that experiential, it's more experimental as you're going through time and maturing with practice. Yeah. Probably time for one more comment at this point, if anyone else wants to offer a reflection or a question, and then I'll talk through a little bit more. No other comments? All right, there'll be more time for that later, but I'll just share some thoughts on this. And again, there's the notes in. Has everyone got the notes that are in the chat, or if people arrived and they don't have that?
Yeah, just please go to the chat, guys, and just download them there. That saves me having to send them to you.
Yep. If it's not there, can you shout out?
Yeah, I haven't got them.
Okay, yeah. I think if people are, I'll pop it back in again.
Right.
If people arrived after I put it in, that you probably won't see it.
Thank you.
No worries. So as Mark had said, I started out in my adult life doing a degree in philosophy and ethics. And that was fantastic training in sort of, growing my hair long and, drinking lots of red wine and asking deep questions like, what the hell am I doing with my life? And, having finished that Bachelor of Arts, I sort of went, there was a dearth of philosophy related jobs in the world, which will astound all of you. And so I ended up going into counselling via a period doing some youth work. And but I suppose for me, I've always been interested in the intersection of areas like philosophy, ethics, spirituality, even things like literature, arts, anthropology, and how they might be informing traditions for our work, as well as more classically psychology. And one of the interesting things that jumped out to me when I looked at those words that we had up on the screen before, when I thought about the words that we were raising in our earlier conversations, is that in a lot of traditions throughout history, they would have called those words virtues. That would be the category that they would use to talk about them. And so I've been doing some of my research over the last, it's about 5 to 7 years. I've been just interested in thinking about, well, are there, learnings from those other traditions about virtue that would help us to unlock practically some of what we're trying to talk about with these sorts of words? In other words, you're thinking, if we were to call those words virtues, what does that open up for us? And there's a part of me that doesn't want to call them virtues. And that's partly because the word virtue is used in a whole bunch of different ways, and it can imply certain things to other people. So it can sound like a moralism. It can invoke a perfectionism, right? And an unhealthy perfectionism around, being virtuous and needing to be some sort of superhuman. It can invoke an idealism. It can also invoke sort of a puritanism and all sorts of things that come associated with it. So I'll just say I'll try to keep away from that side of things and look at it in a much more practical way, which is really to see virtue as a learned trait or a learned characteristic that enables us to thrive in a particular practice. Right? And in that kind of definition, there's a few things, right? The idea that virtue can be learned. So unlike some other traits or some other characteristics that are a bit more unchangeable or a bit more, baked into us, it is something that can be developed with practice, but that it is this sort of enduring or habitual or predictable element of a person's personality, right? And I think Leanne's comment before about the way in which it sort of sinks deep, it becomes part of the way that we be in the world. So it certainly fits within that category of traits, right? It's a trait, becomes a trait of a person, something that distinguishes them in some ways. But then it's a particular type of trait because it's got some value in helping us to do a practice, right? And in the tradition of virtue ethics, so in moral philosophy, the practice that they're looking at is something like human living, okay? So it's a big category where it's like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live well? So we're not doing that question today. because at a more applied level, you could break it down into something more like a role, right? What are the kinds of traits that you look for in a friend, right? In the practice of friendship, what are going to be the sorts of things that people bring into it? Some philosophers have done work on that, particularly Alistair McIntyre. Yeah, and he'd say, yeah, it's hard to imagine someone being able to sustain friendship without certain qualities like fairness, honesty, courage, right? Makes a case for that, right? And we could do it with professional roles. Like, I imagine most of us would want our nurses to be compassionate, or to have some care, to have diligence in what they're doing. I imagine we want our judges to have a real sense of fairness, stability, clear judgment, and you could go on around that. So we're sort of thinking about, well, what are the qualities that, or those traits that make a counsellor? So in that regard, I think that language of virtue does open up 3 or 4 things that are quite helpful to us, or that give us a practical little foothold in understanding how these traits or how these qualities work. One of them, so I said that I want to get away from idealism, but one of the things that virtue does give us is something aspirational, right? And people have called it an aspirational ideal or a regulative ideal. And what they mean by that is that it's not an ideal that's meaningless, but rather that having that picture, having something that we value, something that we look up to, actually has a practical effect in how we regulate ourselves day to day. So give an example of, say me being a father, being a parent, is that I've probably got some images or some visions in my head about what a good parent is, right? And I use that quite unconsciously most of the time to sort of moderate and regulate how I am then going about my parenting, right? And it helps me also to reflect, like it's something to reflect against. If something hasn't gone the way I want, or if I'm not parenting in a way that I'm comfortable with, I'm sort of thinking, so what is it that I'm missing? What is it that I'm kind of looking for? And in the same way, it's sort of like when I'm, being more congruent as a parent, then, it's often with that some of those things have informed me and how I be. So virtue gives us some ideas about what we value in our practice as a counsellor. Then almost at the other end of the spectrum, one of the things that virtue also gives us is a little bit more precise, descriptive language for what can otherwise be a fuzzy or a hard to define or an intangible element of our practice, which we've called variously, presence, way of being, the person of the counsellor, right? And again, when I sit in sort of my educator space, if sometimes I might be, talking with students who are, and people might have encountered this in their own journey as well, where it's kind of like, yes, I'm doing all the skills right, but it's like, I'm just not connecting with the client, something along those lines. Or it's, if someone talked about, it's just not the right fit, those kinds of things. And a phrase like that is meaningful, I think. We're describing something, but it's also a bit of a black box, right? What should I actually be doing differently in order to be a better fit, or in order to connect more, or in order to have a more relatable presence and that kind of thing? And so what virtue does, because when we actually think about it and break it down, is it gives us pointers to what we're looking at. More often than not in our thinking about sort of our internal states of mind, our external or our visual states of action. And so if we kind of think about a question like, or a statement like, I find, Barry more humble than John, right? And we kind of go, well, that's an intelligible sentence, right? If you said, oh, Barry is more humble than John, what we could then ask is, so what do you see in Barry that you're not seeing in John? All right, what would, and if we had the chance to sort of think about this, we would probably delineate some different things. Well, Barry seems to make a more honest, assessment of himself as a person, or, Barry isn't likely to overstate his contribution to something, or whatever it might be. And likewise, we could go through other similar words. Mary is more courageous than Jane, or something like that. What are we seeing in Mary that would allow us to make that statement? So virtue helps us to know what we value, but it also helps us to know ourselves a little bit better. If we actually sit down and think about, so what's my habitual way of being with clients? What are the types of qualities or virtues that mark that? What is it that, when I get stuck, what is it that I'm sort of seeing in myself that needs to be developed, that might be missing? I'll just pause there. Sorry, Jesse, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Jim. I'll just throw my hand in a minute. Yeah, I just had a question about something you just said. It just kind of triggered a little light bulb for me. You said about how, things of, with some clients, it might go well, and then other clients, they're just, we're just not gelling. It's just not the right fit. You were using terminology like that. And then part of what you're sharing is, how do we grow within ourselves, and how do we not just be habitual in how we are, but actually grow and counsel other people and do things we normally do? Is the base assumption from what you're saying that we should effectively be able to counsel anyone and everyone and be fully adaptive in every situation to every person?
It's a really good question. Yeah, and we could probably tease it out a bit more. Generally, I would say no. I wouldn't say that, right? I don't think it's a requirement that we be all things to all people, right? Yeah. However, I think to a degree, we're always, let's say, within a certain within certain parameters, tailoring our way of being to the client in order to facilitate the alliance, right? And the example, I'm going to get more into this in a second, but I gave the example the other day. If you've ever come across the Gloria videos, these classic videos, has everyone ever heard of that? So I reckon 50 or so years ago, they're old. You'll find them on YouTube though, if you just look up the Gloria videos.
Awesome.
Sorry?
They're pretty awesome.
It's a great little learning exercise. Yeah. But three famous therapists of the day: Carl Rogers from person-centered therapy, Fritz Perls from Gestalt therapy, and Albert Ellis from an earlier form of CBT, counseled the same client, Gloria. The idea behind that was to show the same client with three different therapists. And so, as you can imagine, you saw three different styles. I also would love to see a version of that, which is the same counselor with three different clients, because I think there's actually something that interesting that happens in our practice, which is there's something recognizably consistent about that counselor, but also the subtle little variations, the way that we actually attune to the person. And so I think that's sort of what I'm more talking about in terms of adapting or being flexible. Now, in terms of the fit, sometimes it just might not be the right fit, no matter what you're sort of doing. But I think within some parameters, we do make those adjustments. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it, Jim. Thank you.
That's right. Mandy?
Hi. I'm just wondering, is it possible that sometimes if it's not a good fit, that might be more about the client with some specific block to where they want to go with their counselling or don't want to go? Or do you know what I'm trying to say? Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, and not, or it's something, I know, Mark, you gave this example the other day. But a classic one might be very impersonal in some ways, because it's like someone might be, oh, well, I'm looking for someone of a certain gender, right? Or I'm looking for someone with a certain life experience or with a certain knowledge base. It's kind of that thing of going, well, there's some things I can't change about myself. So in that way, it's kind of that is just an impersonal. We don't have to feel insulted about that. It's got nothing to do with us as a practitioner. It's just we're not everything. We're not an amorphous kind of thing, and or at another level around the clients and what they're looking for. Yeah, Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
No, not really. No, I think you've covered
it. Yeah. Folk, all right, are we still sort of good for energy for a few minutes if I give another 5 or 10 minutes of input? Yeah. All right. Mostly nods. I'll go with that. And look, you know, it's Zoom, so you can always turn your camera off and do yoga or, you know, have a shot of coffee or something if you want. So anyway, talked about two elements of what I think virtue adds. I think there's the aspirational element, so the regulative ideal, but then there's a descriptive bit. It helps us to know what we value. It helps us to know ourselves a bit better. The next little bit, and it comes into some of the questions that are being asked, is about with those things established, what virtue also can help us to do, I think, is give us some practical ideas about how we develop as a practitioner. And there's a big story and a little story to that. And what I mean by that is there's the story of how do we develop over time? So how do we foster, and I love the word that I think Rosemary maybe brought up, was that maturity. So how does that journey of maturity unfold? And also that development of with working with a client, with that adaptive work that we're doing to each person that's coming in. And so the big story picture is actually looking at, well, yeah, how do we develop over time? And so I did some direct research around this, interviewing some counsellors. And like I was mentioning before, not one of them said, well, I did this workshop on, you know, becoming a compassionate person, and then all of a sudden I was compassionate. What they were saying were things like, it's experience, right? And that might be life experience, but it might be professional experience as well. It might be, well, I ended up going through a divorce of my own, and that really shaped me. Or it might, you know, made me more empathic or more compassionate to people. Or it might be, you know, I've been working with teenagers for 10 years. I found that unless I was really honest and authentic with them, you know, they wouldn't give me the time of day, you know, so this is how that shaped my way of being. So experience helps. Experimentation, so actually trying things out. So this is what I was saying before about acting your way into a new way of being. I'm going to give it a go. One of my favorite stories from that, from those interviews was a person who's mainly worked in relationship counseling, couples counseling. And she was just talking about, I grew up in a family that avoided conflict. You keep the peace, you keep the harmony. That was the messaging I got, growing up. And so I started couples counseling, and lo and behold, my sessions would just go way out of control. High conflict couples, they're just going to be arguing. And the phrase she uses is like, I had to learn to summon courage, right? I had to learn how to find that bit. And it was little things. It was posture. It was tone. It was about, well, I kind of would straighten my back and I'd find just a slightly firmer, deeper tone of voice to be able to say, we need to stop that discussion right now. And so bit by bit, I learned to be courageous. I had a mindset that went along with it, I am here. If I let this get out of control, this is going to, be damaging for the couple. I owe it to these people to actually take a risk here. And so, it's that experimenting, those little bits, building habits. Other things, role modeling, right, helps. The environment that you're in relationally, the balance of support and challenge. But, again, someone talking about, I was an early practitioner and I, was so obsessed with getting everything right. And then I had this supervisor and I'd observe her work, even on placement, and, she'd get to a point in the midst of her session go, oh, I think I'm going completely down the wrong track. Do you mind if we reset here? And, you know, this interviewee was going, it blew my mind, you know, her humility in that session, and then her authenticity, transparency, honesty with the client. It was like, I never imagined that to be a counsellor, you know, I could just be so relatable. And so that role modeling then helped to shape things.
I love that.
I
love that. I think this is what I come across in my supervision sessions with supervision clients quite often, you know, especially the ones that are just starting out, this urge to do it right. And what if I do it wrong? Like, well, so what? You know, it's just, you know, okay, let's say it slightly less to, oh, no, I might actually say it this way. But it's like, you know, it's a good, and just even share it with a client. You don't have to hold up this persona that just knows it all. And I've been known with clients to actually literally say, I don't know what to say right now. I don't even know what to ask you.
Yeah.
Because just listening to your story, I'm kind of as stuck as you are. So it's like, I have no clue. But let's see if we can unpack this a little bit more and think along the sides. But, you know, yeah, I kind of feel as much in the mud as you are at the moment, and it must be horrible.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing. And the climate of the room changes, doesn't it?
Right?
Yeah. Like, because it's kind of like we can just talk so honestly about how tricky this is.
It's funny though, Jim, and I don't know what the research says about that, but sometimes it's also culturally determined that it then gets been looked at as a bit odd. And I know I'm stereotyping majorly here, but especially in Asian cultures, you're often that they want you to be the expert that actually now tells them what to do because you're the counselor. So, and if you then go like, I have no clue, you kind of take that level of authority away from you where they might not want you anymore because you don't even know what you're talking about. You know, so sometimes it depends probably on the type of client that you got in front of you as well. And just to butt in, because I don't want to butt into your presentation. I was reading an article by Mick Cooper the other day. It says, you know, how are we supposed to be as a counselor? Should we be the Carl Rogers person that just sits there and listen? Or is there also a place to sometimes be more directive and more nearly like a consultant, but just not quite? And according to Mick, you know, the pluralistic approach kind of allows that if that's what the client wants and the client finds that useful. Then there is you know, that was the kind of the summary of that article. He says, sure, you can be that as long as you and the client contract on that. You know, I think you can bring your expertise in. But I think it's so tough, especially in the beginning years. And I still have it now and then, you know, obviously because you've all been to my supervision, people, no one here has imposter syndrome, but it still is very live and kicking in others. It's a beast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rosemary, do you add something there?
Jim, you know, I just wanted to have the question. I haven't really read the article yet, but I just wanted to ask, is the virtues cultivated or is it innate? Like, you know, obviously when you mentioned all of the, you know, the compassion, the humility, courage, I was just thinking, you know, all of that does influence our therapeutic alliance and all that. But is it sort of innate as a counsellor, you know, or do we cultivate or can we cultivate? And I'll put the question of what practices would we need to actually commit to intentionally cultivate that way of being?
Yeah, no, excellent. So I think it's a really interesting way of framing the question. I'll start by saying that I sit in the camp that these are the sorts of things that you can cultivate. But in terms of it being innate, the reason we can cultivate them is because they exist as potentials in human beings, right? So in other words, I think the more helpful way of thinking about that cultivation or integration or expression of virtues is that you're getting in touch with a part of yourself rather than bringing in something external to you, right? So if you sort of have this idea that human beings have the capacity for compassion, which you could say is a combination of empathic connection with the suffering of others, plus a motivation to do something about it, right? So it's like we've got a capacity for compassion. And so what we're trying to do is cultivate, or in other words, to bring that out in ourselves, get in touch with that part. Again, thinking to that interviewee around summoning courage. And again, I think I love that phrase because it was about summoning. It was like, okay, I've got this part of myself. I've got a part of me that, again, if we break down the descriptive part, can sort of approach rather than avoid risk, right? And so it's kind of like, I need to find, again, what's the mindset? So this is the bit around what practices, right? So sometimes it can be the internalizing thing. So it's attitude, perception, interpretation. So that's sort of around, you know, can I cultivate a compassionate frame of mind or a courageous frame of mind? Or I'll use a different virtue. This is where I was glad that people talked about note-taking, organization. One of the virtues that came up quite commonly around counseling, as the one we don't always name, is something like diligence, right? You know, is actually, you know, it's attention to detail. It's, you know, pursuing, you know, a goal. It's patience. It's all of these things that wrap together. So what's a diligent frame of mind? Or it could be habits, right? It could be the practices I commit to. What would be the habits that would be consistent? And they can go really micro, just little changes, little tweaks that people make. But that habituation process, so acting your way into a new way of being. Is that answering your question? Am I being specific?
Yeah, the interpretation, perception, the practical integration. Yes, it has. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Following that one, Jim, I've got a question for you. Are there in the research virtues that are highly ranked as being super useful and potentially virtues that are not so highly ranked or less ranked by clients or by counselors or both?
Yeah, and there's a little bit in there. But there was, I call it a constellation, right? So I actually think that there's this big cloud of words, you know, like you sometimes see a cloud of stars that connect, but there's 6 or so, you know, big words that hold a lot of things together. And they're a lot of what we've been talking about. So things like respect, compassion, humility, honesty, diligence, and wisdom. A few other words that come up regularly, but not quite as regularly, are things like courage, flexibility, creativity. But again, once you sort of break down what those words represent, are more like headings for a lot of associated but nuanced terms. So, for instance, when I use a word like honesty, there's a part of that that's about sincerity, authenticity, congruence. So being real, all right? There's another part about it that's being sort of transparent or trustworthy, being consistent, yeah? There's another part which is about what we would think of as something like truth-telling, so having congruent communication. And so you go, a word like honesty actually has these little subtleties within it. You know, similarly, something like respect, you know, there's an element of what we talked about before of seeing that person as being, you know, experiencing the same human condition that I'm in. You know, we have words like regard, worth, prizing, that come up, and they fit around this idea of respect. Yeah. So it is a bigger pool, but I think those summarize a lot of it.
And has the research also identified words that clients potentially don't find that important in counselors where we might think they are? Does that make sense? Like we think it's really important where the client goes like, I actually don't care. I've seen that to a degree, where we sometimes think that our credentials are so important, and then clients often just don't give a toss about that. As long as you just can talk with them, they're quite happy. You know, some will, but then it's lower ranked.
Yeah.
So wondering if there's more like that, like, you know, studiousness or I don't know, academic skill or something might not be so important for a client where we think it is very important.
I think that again, I haven't looked at that quite so specifically, so I'm just drawing on a few different things. But I mean, going back, I showed you a little bit of that stuff around client preferences, and it is that balance of competence and warmth. And so, again, one of the things I want to always make sure I'm saying is, I'm not saying skills are unimportant, not saying knowledge is unimportant, not saying competence. It's and, right? It's the personal and the professional brought together. So again, how a client assesses competence might be, you know, for one client, it's like, well, my counsellor has to have a PhD. If they don't have a PhD, you go, well, good on you, you snob. But, you know, that's how they're looking at competence. Rather, someone else might sort of pick up different signals in order, but that's, again, what bringing together what we have looked at, they seem to be the things people are looking for. Yeah.
Sure.
So on that, I've got one more little bit. I'm loving the questions, and I won't go with that, but I'll just sort of finish off the story a little bit. Because we've talked about the aspirational, so the regulative ideal. We've talked about the descriptive, so actually, you know, helps us to know ourselves a bit better. We've talked about that big picture of development, you know, the building of habits or building a habitual way of being. And so at that sort of point in the story, we've got, well, we have sort of a preferred way that we like to be, or we've developed often a characteristic way. So, you know, if you had a colleague that knows your work well, they might describe you in certain ways, for instance. But then we've got this little story. So, you know, the day-to-day or the client-to-client responsiveness. And so I actually think virtue helps us here too, in also developing a responsive way of being. So doing those little bits of tailoring. And I'll give an example in almost the negative way that I came across recently for myself, about 18 months ago. I'd still do a little bit of client work. A lot of the work I do is cross-cultural, working with refugee survivors of trauma. I particularly do a lot of work in immigration detention. And so people are going through some pretty tough stuff in the midst of that. And it's often, you know, part of the work we're doing is a lot of holding work, a lot of bearing witness, a lot of validation for people in what they're going through. But anyway, I had a couple of sessions with the client, and then I called to arrange another session, and he said, actually, I think I'd like to see a different counsellor. And I said, well, that's absolutely all right. But I was a bit surprised. Yeah, I've been doing this work for a while. Don't get too many clients that ask to get moved off me. So my team leader called him back, and I said, look, if he has any feedback, I'm really open to hearing this. Anyway, the feedback came back, and it was this thing of going, oh, look, you know, he was fine. I'm sure he knows what he's doing. But what I felt with him, as in with me, what the client felt from me was that I was pitying him. And obviously that would be nothing I'd ever intend to show to someone. So how do I break that down, or how do I then think about, well, if we use this sort of virtue lens and we actually think of that constellation of virtues, right? What happens over time is we often settle into a fairly habitual, predictable way of being. There are things that we bring out there might be strengths to our practice. Now, I think I would bring, and people around me would give me this feedback, I bring a lot of compassion to my work, a lot of empathy, a lot of care, a lot of responsive caregiving. But what I think that particular client picked up from my expression of compassion, and maybe somewhat clumsily expressed, was that, that I was feeling sorry for him, that I didn't see him as someone who was strong, or that had pride, or that had dignity. And so what I need to think about, one way I thought about that is, so I need to balance my compassion with respect, right? With sending a message of, I actually think, you know, you've got a lot of strength about you. I actually think that you're a very capable person in the midst of this world. And so it was that idea of, you know, I needed to actually be more responsive to picking up and going, well, I need to integrate some of that more, you know, that message of respect or that message of worth back to him. And so, you know, it's one way of thinking through this idea of, well, how to be responsive to people. It's like, well, with this client, I might need a lot of patience, right? You know, they're dealing with, you know, a long-term addiction that they're trying to throw. So we're always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I really want the solution and I want to see this done and I'm putting in all of this effort, but I'm going to need some patience in the midst of it, right? Or, you know, here's a client that's, you know, been through something really different to my own life experience or from a different culture. I'm going to need some humility. I'm going to need to be able to recognize the limits of my knowledge. You know, or there's a client, I think I need to challenge them. I need to find that courage. I need to find that honesty, that straightforwardness in working. Or this person wants a really straightforward approach. So do you get the picture? So again, those virtue words, I think, give us little handles or little clues on, well, how can I adapt to this person and what they need? Yeah. So that's kind of the big picture. So I think these are sorts of things that the virtue language can start to give us in the midst of our practice. But back to you. Where's this landing? What are your reflections? Are there any other questions?
I've got a question around what you're talking about here. And I'm not actually even sure how to frame it. So I'm hoping you might be able to understand. So where does, we talk about emotional intelligence all of the time, you know, and so where does emotional intelligence fit into the picture? And are we or do we have the capacity or should we have the intention of increasing our feeling vocabulary, not in a word sense but in a felt sense, you know, so that you know, we don't have to be able to express all the different nuances of feeling, but for us to be able to feel them so we can then mirror the, you know, where the client's at in a nuanced way. So is that something we develop, or is it, or we could look at so that you can mirror more easily maybe, or is that a life experience thing?
Oh, that's a really excellent question. And I don't mean, I'm not expecting you to have sort of a dictionary perfect definition, but what's your sense of emotional intelligence? Like when you, what do you
I think
see that
it's
as
emotional, yes, it's having an awareness of the emotional wheel, you know, and so that it's not just angry, happy, sad. It's like, what are the nuances of you know, trauma experiences for that matter, you know? And so it's actually been able to break it's almost like the color wheel, you know, you start with red, yellow, and then you end up with a plethora of colors just from 3. So, you know, is it incumbent for us to actually to be able to know the differences between your sort of nuanced feelings, you know, so that we don't have to so that you can feel it as, you know, as you kind of feeling with them, I suppose.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
It's a really good question. I'll probably be reflecting on this for some weeks from now. I mean, my instinctive right now response is sort of thinking again around what I think are the 3 big categories of counselling practice and development, which is something like knowledge, skills, and personal or development of the person. And obviously there's a Venn diagram bit to it all, right? There's overlapping stuff. Because I go at one level, what you're describing around emotional intelligence is kind of like a profession-specific knowledge. Like, you know, there's actually a knowledge piece to this, which is how expansive is my vocabulary about emotions, and not just my vocabulary, so you've got the terms, but then my theory of emotions in terms of how they interact, how they interrelate. You know, I remember one very early supervisor blew my mind when he introduced the idea of the functionality of emotions, just with a question, which is, or a statement, which is something like, you know, we often feel angry when something that's precious to us is under threat, right? And you go, what a wise thing to say about anger. And that's been really useful. So that's sort of the bit. But then I reckon, you know, wonder whether the virtue bit or the personal stuff is the empathy piece, you know, and felt empathy, but also empathy as a highly attuned version of perception, right? Like it's actually it is you know, like how you know, some people attune their palate to be able to taste subtleties in wine or whiskey or food, right? It's kind of like there's an attunement of our perception. You know, what am I looking closely for? And that's taking in data internally as well as picking up all sorts of subtleties coming from the other person. And that would be the virtue bit for me, would be, yeah, how do I build up that empathy capability? What's that pathway? Yeah. I'll be thinking about that for a while. That's a really good question.
I like those feeling wheels, Jim. Is there something like the virtue wheel as well, aside from that diagram that you showed us? But is there like a universe of virtues that we kind of can tap into in terms of finding out what virtue would be the good one to develop potentially in particular settings?
Yeah, well, I've put a few things. I mean, I don't necessarily want to get into it because it's probably a boring academic thing, but I mean, people know positive psychology. Have you come across that, you know, field? Been around 25 years or so. And I've got opinions about it, which I won't bore you with, but so I don't wholly jump into that camp. But I think one of the things they did do really interestingly, particularly Martin Seligman's work, was delineate that sort of stuff. So there's a few links in those notes where they've actually given much more of that practical. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, developing as a counsellor, and they list sort of 40 or more different, they call them character strengths. And so, yeah, if you're looking for something like that, that does give some really practical things. And they break it down in interesting ways, which is like, here's some movies you can go watch that, you know, exemplify that, or, you know, here are some figures from history that could be seen as role models. And so it does get to that lovely practical detail of, you know, how would you go about thinking about this strength or thinking about this virtue?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I love that VIA character strengths profile thing. Yeah, I'll put that in the chat for everyone. Like, I've done that a couple of times, and it's funny how consistent it stays. There might be a bit of a swap in priority.
Yeah.
But generally the top 10 roughly stays the same. It's like, okay, yeah, that's kind of describes me, but then it's the fun one to start working with the bottom feeders. Like, well, there's definitely something I can learn there. Yeah, I like that one.
Actually, something that came up in our last session, and something that was true in that little example that I gave of the client that felt pitied by me. And I think it's a really interesting part of the virtue ethics theory, which is that for every virtue, you've actually got sort of two associated problems or two associated vices. One is deficiency, right? So that's when you don't have enough of it. But then the other is excess, right? That there's actually too much, and that becomes problematic. So an easy example is something like courage, where you can imagine a deficiency of courage, which would be cowardice. You know, so I'm not brave enough. But then there's an excess of courage, isn't there, where you are rash, where you rush in where angels fear to tread. And so there's actually that idea that there's too much of it. You could think of what too much honesty looks like. You could think of what too much humility looks like. You could think of what too much generosity looks like, right? And how that would get you into problems. So it's not just a case of more the better. And the reason I bring that up is Michael Carroll, the supervision guru, often comments that as practitioners, where we get stuck more often is actually in our strengths. And that was the example I gave before. It's sometimes when we haven't tempered our strengths, or we have a strength, but in this particular circumstance, it became a weakness or it became a problem. And so it's an interesting part of the virtue theory, is that it's not just about, well, what else do I need to build up? It's also just about thinking, so where might I get stuck in this? Or what would too much of this look like? Yeah.
Yeah. Virtue sounds so friendly, hey, but it can become it can become a nasty thing every now and then if you use too much of it and get stuck.
Oh yeah. But we come across clients that are too kind, right? And get walked over, and we come across people who are too honest and their opinions get into like it's I think it's a real dynamic.
Fun. Anyone any questions for Jim? Because I think we're slowly getting there. Comments, questions, thoughts, counter opinions potentially. Yeah.
Limitations. Yeah.
While you have them, you might as well fire them at them.
Yeah, I find it interesting to realize that with your virtues as well, if I know a little bit more about it, or know a bit more about what virtues there are, how to use language around that, just to make that sort of tweak a bit more with clients. But also, especially because my English is not as you can hear with my Dutch accent, is not my first language. So that sometimes that is already a handicap, but I realize now that's something I can improve just by finding the right words to use to bring that certain trade in,
What's your first language, Nancy?
I'm Dutch.
Dutch, okay, I mean, it'd be interesting to, I mean, even in your own language and traditions, what are the qualities of people that are, upheld? Because I think there's some interesting cross-cultural things around this, and sometimes that can get overstated. I think there's a lot of this. I think is very common amongst humanity, but again, you go to say like the Confucian tradition of virtue, there'd be these really high priorities placed on, virtues that contribute to harmony, right? So that's sort of the goal, and so you sort of find that's what a good life looks like. So the virtues change, right? If you go to ancient Sparta, where you've got a warrior culture, again, there's different virtues that sort of, a good life is to be able to die bravely, or, that kind of thing, or to be able to, so you can kind of see how you get these little subtleties that come out of, cultural priorities.
Yeah.
Us Dutchies generally have an excess of honesty and straightforwardness.
Right. Yeah.
That sometimes is interpreted as a bit harsh. Know that one. Yeah.
So I had a hand up, I thought.
Yeah, go right. I just wanted to ask further about the limitations, especially when you're applying this virtue-based theory to practice. And a lot of the work that we do is evidence-based frameworks. So how does it all integrate into like your trauma-informed, your person-centered, your relational type of therapies? Because I'm thinking of the word resilience, and so would that be a way, or how do we do it?
I'm not sure if I've totally got the question. So when you talk about integrating it into those sorts of
evidence-based, because
in terms of for the client or for you as a practitioner,
I think this is more about you working with the client in practice.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the tricky bit, or where this would fit in the big evidence-based conversation, is around, I suppose, what we would call the common factors element to that evidence, right? And so the idea being that while you know, certain interventions have got a certain influence on the outcome of therapy in different areas, there also seems to be, and actually overwhelmingly, the evidence points towards factors that are common to different modalities having an influence on outcome. And one of those is the therapists themselves, right? And so it's well established, very, very, very well established, that there's a little bit of debate about how much variance can be accounted for by the individual practitioner, but sits between 5 and 10%. The higher one in more natural, so in practice, the lower one in research settings where they control variables. The implication of that is quite huge. And I've got colleagues at the university in like nursing and midwifery and other areas. And how I would explain that to them is something like, so imagine you're lying in a hospital bed and someone wheels up a trolley and it's got about 15 different medications on it. And they sort of say, well, most of these medications more or less work as well for your condition as the others. However, the person that gives you that medication is going to influence the outcome by 5 to 10%, right? And the question would then be, well, can you give me the person that gives me the better outcome, right? Like it's the natural follow-up question would be, well, what makes that difference? What's the variance about? And that's the piece we're still filling in, right? That's where I sort of said we've only got 50 to 100 studies on that question. But I suppose where it comes to is you go, well, in evidence-based practice, what you would be saying is the person who is delivering the treatment is going to be an influence on the outcome. And so we need to attend to those things that we know and that we're coming to know make the difference in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you think about sustainability as well, you know, that approach, how do you contribute to that? How do you contribute to that?
How does the practitioner contribute to sustainability? Yeah. To sustain themselves in the work and right. And I think that's just a different question. Well, I mean, it's a related question, but it's also another way of approaching it. It's like, well, not all value has to be placed in evidence base. And so there's also just a question around what are the demands of the practice and what does it take to do this work in the face of those demands, right? And you can ask similar questions of what does it mean to be a paramedic? What does it mean to be a teacher? You know, and so there's just that element of this is a practice. What does it take to be a practitioner? And so that's another angle. Yeah.
I take that on. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd like to make a comment. We still have time. One more, I think, and then we'll call it quits. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Just listening to everything that you've said, Jim, and everything everyone else has been adding has made me think a little bit about my own journey to being a therapist, and an analogy that I often reflect on. I think it might be useful. I spent the first half of my life being an orchestral musician and training to a high level in Western tradition classical music.
Yeah.
One of the things that always comes to me as part of why counselling is what I do now is that we work for so long on these 3 bits that you're talking about: the skills, the ability to stand up there and present ourselves, perform. But the thing that's the third level, which to me is the person, the therapist that you're speaking of, is the difference between someone that will go to a Western, you know, when we go to one of these concert halls to hear a world-renowned soloist, we're actually looking for a person who is truly themselves and truly aware of every part of themselves, able to really represent themselves. And it almost brings in that comment that it was really early on about was the one that you said we'll come to that. Who was it who said that? Was talking about collusion.
Oh yeah. Sorry, Sandra, we haven't
I don't know. I was just going to address that because I feel, well, not address it, but mention that I feel like there's something there around performance analogy between being a counsellor and learning to fully represent yourself, be truly authentic and congruent. And then the people that are listening to you, they don't need to feel that you're colluding with them because there you are being you. And somehow they then feel this sense that they can be themselves without there being what Western psychological lens would talk about as too much personal kind of self-disclosure, etc. I don't know. It's just, I think it's an interesting analogy, performance, and we all know, we can imagine sitting hours practicing away, and then suddenly you get to this point where you can perform and people listen because they hear the authenticity.
I mean, it's beautiful analogy. And I love as well, like, I mean, again, when we use a word like catharsis, I mean, that initially emerged in the arts. I mean, that's an old Greek term, and it got applied to therapy. But again, that experience of being in the audience and something moving through you, like this purging of a thing that you've been carrying, because of what happens on the stage. I mean, anyone that's been in that moment is profound experience. But I think you're right, isn't it? That the artist has to, not just learn the technique, but then they've got to somehow bring their whole humanity into the performance or into the expression of their art.
And on a stage, you can do that without colluding, without crossing a boundary which feels maybe fearful to you. And I'm sure there's something in that which is useful to counselling.
Somewhere. Right. And I think it's something. Again, I think, go, Sandra. You brought the question initially. What's your reflection?
So number one, and I think I really love what you spoke about, because in a past life I used to be a professional writer, so there's similarities there on that sort of relational dynamic to performance, and also I'm reminded of watching a lot of those voice shows, and the people judging often say it was so good because I could just relax. I didn't see you doing the thing. Like, I didn't see you thinking about the notes or thinking about the performance. You were just so in the performance, and then they liked it because they could not judge, they just got to enjoy it. And that really reminds me of what you were saying. With the collusion, I think what I've been reflecting on since we've been talking is the times it probably has come up for me most is when I'm doing an intake with clients who are often already involved with child safety. So they're often relaying stuff that is known already. So I'm not in a reporting frame, but I'm hearing their story. But because it's intake, I can't necessarily be, and it's also what, Jim, you've been talking about, where we change over time with our client. When you've got more therapeutic rapport, I would probably not feel like I'm colluding, because I would actually say, okay, woo, we just need to go back to that thing you just said, but because I'm in this intake space, and often with these clients, I actually don't get to work with them individually. There's limitations within my role as to what I can do. So I'm not feeling like just for clarification, I'm not feeling like I'm colluding because I'm sharing personal information. It's just because I'm hearing a story that is by rights seriously concerning and harmful to others. And I'm not necessarily able in that moment to say, whoa, we need to stop and talk about that, because that is a seriously harmful frame of mind that you're carrying around in the world. But I think I've answered my own question by recognizing part of my struggle is it's in that intake phase, and it's not really the space to then open that conversation. There's no real rapport. I've literally just met this person, so on and so forth. So
great. So it's constraint. It's the setting, it's the context, isn't it, that makes a difference there.
Are we all done? Pretty much.
Thanks everyone for your input. That's been a really exciting conversation.
Massive thanks again, Jim. I'll learn more. So I'm the lucky one, because I actually got to listen to you twice. So that's beautiful. So thanks for presenting. Really appreciated this, because I think this is something that plays for all of us. Like, who are we and who do we want to be, and what is the role model of the consummate counselor, that we're all trying to strive for, and how do we relate to that? So there's always work in progress. But that's the fun side of this stuff as well. It just never stops. And it's just, there's always more to develop and let go of and redevelop. So yeah, many thanks. We'll be following your research, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, thanks for giving me the chance. Yep.
Thanks for your cooperation, guys. Always appreciate it. Really quick. Next month, 23rd of February, 3 to 5, Queensland. I'll put it in an email. Or Friday, the 27th, 2 to 4, Queensland. That'll all be in an email. I'll talk about a relational frame theory, give you a bit of an idea of what sits behind ACT. Love that, because it's the basis of all communication. I find cognitions, thought, language, words, symbols, all that stuff. So that'll be me. In March, I'll have another guest speaker, bit of a secret now, but you'll find out soon enough. So that's that one. And yeah, thanks for being here. The group is the group because of you. Otherwise, I'll be talking to myself, and that's pretty boring. So thanks very much for being here. Enjoy your weekend. And if you got questions, feel free to email me. And I'll put Jim's LinkedIn profile in the email as well that you'll get. So I'll send my invoice there, LinkedIn profile, so you can always contact him, I hope. And he's open to connecting. 100%. And we'll keep the discussion going.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thanks, people. Catch you next time.
Thank you.
Enjoy. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Mark.
Okay.